Managerial Economics, Lecture 12. As far as I'm concerned, we're done with Chapter 3. We got two options now. Option 1 is continue with Theory of Optimization in Chapter 4. And the other option is discuss your questions on Saudi economy, at least the way I understand it. So which one it is? Discussion. Okay, what's your question? What's your question about the Saudi economy? So number 1, you said you're suffering from rising, at least originally, gasoline prices due to rising oil prices, but the king helped out and said fix the prices low, right? You're suffering from rising food prices. You're suffering from rising real estate and possibly, well, certainly rental prices. So practically all prices are going up. Yes. We just call this inflation. That's what it is. So, what is the reason for inflation? Well, this simply means that everyone has more money to spend for a particular period of time. And the only way to have more money to spend for a particular period of time is that you have more money in circulation. So, the true underlying genuine cause of inflation is increase in the money supply. But now the question is, why is the money supply of Saudi Arabia rising so rapidly? So actually, let's make a correction. 2 lectures ago, I discussed the Saudi economy, the money supply, remember, and I said roughly 30%, and I sent you an email. The number is 20% and slowed down to 19.54, right? Yes. Alright, so the problem, the underlying problem of the inflation today is the rapidly rising money supply in Saudi Arabia. But the question is, why is now the money supply rising so fast?
Oil prices? Oil prices?
No, certainly not. Oil prices can go, okay, so let's explain this. Oil prices can go to 10, to 50, to 100. It doesn't matter. Money supply is the quantity, pieces of paper, right, which you guys call, and I, Riyals, right? And the quantity of printing Riyals, right, is independent of the price of oil. So the price,
How can it rise while the income is still low or still stable?
Okay, so now let's define, because it's very important, we actually had this discussion. You have 2 types of income. So, income actually will be for a person or a family, and income will be for the whole economy. National income. So, income is also what we call real income and also nominal income. Nominal income is the quantity of Riyal that you actually get over a particular period of time. Real income is the quantity of goods and services which you can purchase with those Riyal. So, now the question that I have to you, income is rising, which income is rising? Nominal income or real income? Only the quantity of Riyal, or also the quantity of tomatoes, cucumbers, and whatever you're buying?
Nominal. So,
nominal income is rising. Well, the question is now, do prices rise faster or slower than nominal income?
Faster.
Oh, so everyone says prices rise faster than nominal income, which means necessarily that real incomes actually are falling. Okay, so the root of the problem, so essentially the major concern to everyone in Saudi Arabia is that real incomes are essentially falling due to rising prices, and prices rise due to rising money supply. According to the latest official statistics coming out of SAMA are, 19.4, 19.5%. I sent it to you last week over the email. And the question is, why is SAMA printing so much? What's driving the Saudi Monetary Authority, Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, to print so much?
Is that inflation?
Okay, that's the point I've been making. Not because there is inflation they have to print. You have inflation because they're printing. No, that is part of the
The high
problem.
price of the oil.
Again, this is exactly what I was responding to her. Just because the price of oil goes from 65 to 70 doesn't mean that Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority will print more. Okay? They're just
It has nothing to do with the war.
Yes, nothing to do. Okay, so what it has to do with what is called fixed exchange rate. What is the fixed exchange rate today?
3.75.
Okay, 3.75. So we call it USD divided by Riyal or Riyal divided by USD. USD divided by Riyal get 3.75. This simply means the following. This simply means that if you're having here a monetary base, which represents so-called reserves. Reserves, we call these reserves currency. Currency reserves. These are the reserves which back the Saudi Riyal. In other words, when they print money, they usually have something that covers or backs those reserves. Oh, sorry, those Riyals. What are the Saudi reserves? What are the typical?
Gold.
Gold and
US dollars.
USD. Correct. USD. So, if the ratio is fixed, this means that whatever is the quantity of dollars, the quantity of Riyal must necessarily be exactly 3.7 times higher. Okay? Simple as that. So, this also means something else. If the quantity of dollars doubles, it must be that the quantity of Riyal doubles. Well, why it must be? Couldn't it?
It's related.
Because it's related. But the question is, what if they don't print so much? What if they print less?
Then the exchange rate will change.
Oh, the exchange rate will change. In other words, if you will be maintaining this ratio of 3.75 for every new dollar in reserves, you must necessarily print 3.75. Otherwise, there will be a shortage of the one currency or the other. And if there is a shortage of Riyal, in other words, for every dollar they print a Riyal. So suddenly what's going to happen is shortage of?
Isn't there a shortage of liquidity nowadays?
Okay, shortage of liquidity. Liquidity is a very different concept. Well, remind me to talk about liquidity in a minute because I'm still trying to explain this basic concept. The problem is that as soon as you create one Riyal but exchange it by 3.75, there's going to be a major problem, and one of two things. They have to print up more Riyal to realign back to 375, or the exchange rate will change to 1 to 1, okay? So the point is, there is no way to maintain at the same time the 3.75 unless you necessarily print 3.75 for every new dollar. So the key question now is, are the currency reserves rising in order to rise the quantity of Riyal? And the answer is shockingly simple. If we call these SAR, standing for Saudi Arabian Riyal, if SAR, delta, let's do this, delta SAR equals 20% in 1 year, this certainly means that the reserves, delta reserves, equal 20% annually. So, the problem is number one, fixing the exchange rate, but also two, accumulation of reserves. So the question now becomes, why is Saudi Arabia getting more and more and more dollars? And the answer is, of course, it's not only Saudi Arabia, it's the same with China, the same with Korea, the same with Japan, the same with Russia, the same with all other countries. How could it be possible that all major countries in the world that hold dollars, their dollar reserves fundamentally increase, and increase at the rapid rate of 20% on average? And the answer is shockingly simple. This is because the US dollar supply is rising at a very rapid rate, approximately 15–20% annually, and also due to the US current account deficits. In other words, Americans consume more than they produce. This results in a trade or current account deficit, and the difference they cover how? How do they pay for the difference? Print more money and give it to someone, okay? In other words, the heart of the problem is that Americans are consuming more than they're producing. They cover those deficits, trade deficits, with printing money. And Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, China, and all the other countries with current account surpluses effectively buy and take those dollars, okay? In other words, they allow for the United States to sustain the current account deficits, and they, on the other hand, allow to sustain the current account surpluses. So, you can think of it one of the two ways. The one way is Americans consume too much, print too much. That's the one way to think about the problem. But the mirror image is that Saudi Arabians are willing to accept paper dollars and dollars or assets, which the American government can increase at will. You know, we can print, just put more zeros, no problem. And the Saudi Arabian government is doing this, okay? So, on the one hand, Americans are the problem. On the other hand, the SAMA is the problem, okay? So, what is the effective solution? The effective solution is to make the exchange rate changing. So from 375, if you lower it to 350, this will make oil more expensive for Americans. Again, if they continue to run the surpluses and Saudi Arabia continues to increase their reserves, then lower to 3. In other words, there is one solution, no other solution. There is only one solution. And one solution is that Saudi Arabia must revalue the currency. In other words, rather than exchange 375 for 1, to exchange 2 for 1. If necessary, to exchange 1 to 1. If there is a revaluation, two things happen at the same time. The purchasing power of the Riyal is stronger. The Riyal strengthens, so the average Saudi will be able to buy more of foreign goods, and at the same time, which is mathematically equivalent, the purchasing power of the dollar falls, so Americans will be able to buy less. So, even though Saudi Arabia may be accumulating Riyal, if you revalue, the quantity of Riyal will not be increasing as fast. In other words, you increase reserves by 20%, but you revalue by 20%. This means the quantity of Riyal may stay fixed. Then, number one, you all don't suffer from inflation. You all don't suffer from falling real income. And your purchasing power rises, but most importantly, you will not be running as much surpluses against the United States. In other words, Saudi Arabia will not be financing America's current and trade account deficits. So this is the solution, and someone does this in the GCC. Kuwait, yes, Kuwait has begun. The problem is Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, is expanding reserves at over 20%, which means that they must revalue by 20% in order to negate or offset the increase in reserves. But Kuwait is revaluing by what? 2, 3%? 4%, right? In other words, they revalue, but they revalue too little to have a meaningful effect. Because if reserves are growing at 20%, money supply is growing at 20%, revaluing at 2% isn't going to cure much, right? It's going to cure very little.
But didn't that...
Okay, question. Let's one at a time.
In the last 2 years,
Okay.
there was a lot of people on economics, especially in the newspapers and the TV, they are asking the government to reevaluate the
Correct.
exchange rate. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but the problem is the government always, refuse it.
Okay.
So why is the government refusing? For who? The benefit of the Americans they are refusing, or for political?
Okay. So number one, the one thing is sure. If the government refuses to revalue, one thing is sure. It benefits the US government. It benefits the United States by financing more of US deficits. So one of the reasons could be purely political. Now, that will be one of the reasons. A second, okay, go ahead.
I heard one of our professors, peer professors, he said that when you look at it from the government point of view, is that when they exchange dollars for like 3.75 riyals, to them this is more money than
Correct.
exchanging it to 350 or 3.
Correct. Yes, this is absolutely true, and this is where sometimes incompetency enters the scene, because they think that if they exchange, let's say instead of 3.71, if they exchange 3, they're going to be getting less.
But it's stronger.
But the problem is, yes, but number one, first, the Riyal is stronger, but number two, by exchanging less, they will be accumulating less dollars. What is the problem? There's a fundamental problem with accumulating dollars. And the fundamental problem is that the dollar itself is losing value due to US inflation. So, essentially, these reserves may be growing by 20%, but if the dollar is falling by 20% annually, you're essentially gaining nothing. Effectively, Saudi Arabia is financing the United States for almost free, all right? In other words, if you have currency reserves and the dollar devalues by 20%, the 20% loss of real purchasing power of the dollar is pure gain to the United States and pure loss to Saudi Arabia.
But they say we have big projects or big investments in America, that's why we can't do that.
Okay, so these could be political reasons. In other words, we call this a word in this. It's called racket, okay? In other words, what is happening is the US is coming back and saying, you begin to revalue, which is going to hurt us, and you have so many investments, and those investments will hurt you, okay? So it's working like this. Let's explain how it's working. It's called the old proverb of having a banker. When you owe a bank the bank $1,000, you have a banker. When you owe the bank $1 million, you have a partner. This simply means that, when you owe the bank $1,000, the $1,000 is your problem. When you owe the bank $1 million, it's the bank's problem. In other words, when you owe too much money for what you can actually pay, then it is actually the bank's problems. You understand? Is it fairly intuitive? I mean, you got to understand that it's actually the bank's problem because the bank can't really collect. So essentially, what now happens is Saudi Arabia, China, etc., Russia have accumulated over $3 to $4 trillion of U.S. reserves, and there is no value, there is no production. Okay, so that's where the problem is. And when Dubai, you'll tell me what the company was, tried to buy Dubai Ports, tried to buy an American company, which means convert paper tickets with an American president to convert it to a real company. Americans said no, right? In other words, they don't want to sell a real asset with real value for paper dollars. Chinese wanted to buy an oil company a couple of years ago, and Sinop or Sinopec, and when they wanted to buy the American oil company, they said, no, you can't buy the company. Again, you have to understand what's going on is moving these dollars back to the US actually does two things. Number one, a US asset becomes a Chinese asset or Saudi Arabian asset. Number one. Number two, the money moves back to the United States. So now you have more money in the United States and less assets because the asset was sold to China and is now Chinese or Saudi Arabia. All right? So the trick now for the US government is to prevent those dollars from coming back. In other words, you can accumulate as many dollars as you wish, but you cannot cash those dollars. You can't really buy anything of value, all right? So that's the one thing. And of course, now the real problem is that Saudi Arabia has so many investments in the United States. You know, Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, government bonds and everything else that you guys revalue your currency. This means we will devalue your investments.
Yeah, but it's very down now.
Yeah, exactly.
Now it's because of the US economy, it's really low, so it doesn't...
I understand. I understand. So here's something else. What is really happening now is early on in the game, it makes sense to lend more. In other words, you're my banker, you're loaning me a second $1,000. Sure, I can probably pay because I make $2,000. Then you lend me a third $1,000, I can pay. Now, you know, I'm making $2,000 a month, but you've already lent me $500,000. It doesn't make sense to lend me another $500,000 to keep consuming. And if you lend me $1 million, it's going to be fairly dumb to lend me a second $1 million, but I'm making $2,000 a month because I'll never be able to pay back. No, even if I become your slave. That's the reason. So the reason is, from a certain low point, it makes perfect sense to provide loans, debts, to accumulate certain assets, as long as the other party has some sensible ability to pay back. But from a certain point on, it makes no sense if I'm making, let's say, $50,000 a year, and I already owe you $1 million for you to loan me a second $1 million, because it's not very likely. So now we are getting to this so-called inflection point where suddenly a lot of monetary authorities like Saudi Arabian, but also Russians, Chinese, Indians, etc., begin to realize that America has accumulated so many debts to the point where America is not likely to pay back. We have a concept in economics. How do we call this? Back in the old days, 100 years ago, we just said that America is broke. Right? You know what's broke?
Yes.
Yeah.
But today we have the modern term of bankrupt. Bankrupt. So, inability to pay to service debt. Now, technically that's not the case, because all those debts are dollar denominated and they can always print some more to pay back. But the lender must realize that the lender itself is extremely vulnerable. Let's do this. You should all, and I'll send you an email, but there are a lot of people maybe watching this video. There is a top guy in the world, one of the best, who has provided the best explanations, who has a radio show, and his name is Peter Schiff. Have I sent you anything for Peter Schiff? He's one of the top guys. You were asking me a question. One of the best in the world. He has provided the best explanations from the credit crisis, starting from forecasting that the credit crisis is actually there, will be there, what the problems are, what the causes are, what the fixes are, how and why the government is doing what it's doing, how it's making a bad problem worse and everything else. And Peter Schiff has been the best economic analyst in the world, discussing these global imbalances and the problems of accumulation of reserves and the problems that America has effectively bankrupted itself over the last 3, 4, or 5 years because it owed 1 trillion just 5 years ago and now owes 4 trillion. It could service 1 trillion potentially, but 4 trillion it cannot service with real goods. The only way to service it by printing more. In other words, to print. In other words, it's called to inflate your debt. To inflate your debt means that you service old debt by printing new money and effectively devaluing, you pay down once and you devalue the currency and the debt twice. Europac.net. He has a radio show and he has a commentary. Also remind me, I'll send you an email with links. One of the best guys ever. You will be very convinced if you actually get to read his stuff from 2003, 4, and 5, how he's been talking about the coming crisis, the credit crunch, and all of those things. And it's easy to convince yourself because you see now all of those things happen. Remarkably, and I wonder how, of course I use this guy in my other investment course, this guy's actually coming to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh. There's going to be a global competitiveness conference in Riyadh. When is that? And he's going to be a guest speaker. So he's been invited. So now the world is beginning to catch up with what's going on. And suddenly they're beginning to catch up with this guy's actually the best of the best in the world. And now has been invited to talk to sovereign wealth funds and the king and the family and whatnot, and it's going to be providing really good lectures. But you should begin listening to him, see what's going on. So, questions? Questions?
If we remove this fixed exchange rate, you mean that our Saudi Riyal will be more than 3.5?
It will be more valuable. To be more valuable, it means that you must be exchanging less.
But
for dollar.
The problem is we are selling our oil the most to America. That means we'll sell it with low price.
Okay. Again, the exchange rate changed. So once the exchange rate changed, yes, it will be to a little lower price, but for the Americans, it will be more expensive. Okay, it will be more expensive to Americans. In other words, with this, you will make it more expensive, relatively more expensive to Americans, and relatively cheaper for other countries, okay? So it will become relatively cheaper for Chinese and others. So it's true you will be getting less Riyal. But the point is, every time you must think of not the quantity of Riyal, but the purchasing power of it. Yes, you will be getting less Riyal, but the Riyal will have more purchasing power. Both for the king and for you.
Everything is going to the market. Everything going to the supermarket because we are an importing country. Everything will be cheaper. You will have the same.
Yes, money. Everything will be, let's say, relatively cheaper. Relatively cheaper means rather than growing at 15% annually, it would grow at 5%. If you revalue too much or enough, then it could be becoming actually cheaper. Ideally, the Saudi government should be revaluing by a little more than the reserves grow, so that everything will be falling a little bit in price. Okay? That will be the ideal case. But again, you have too much politics into it. Now, here is something else that you have to realize. During the process of revaluation, instead of 375, you revalue to 300. And you have accumulated, for example, $375 billion, right? By 3.75, this gives roughly 15,000 Saudi Riyal, right? If you have accumulated this amount of dollars, which is now worth 15 billion, right? That's actually trillion. The act of revaluation means a sudden recognition of loss of reserves, a purchasing power of reserves. All right? In other words, the minute that you recognize, again, you got to understand that That's not the correct way to think. The correct way to think is not that the Saudi Riyal was revalued. The correct way to think is that the dollar was devalued instead. Okay? So, by devaluing the dollar by 10%, this means, oh, we had 375 billion. We just recorded a loss of 37 billion. Well, no politician or whatever the framework is willing to admit today the loss of 3.75. If you're one of those, it's better to say we increased from 3.75 to 400. We added extra 25 billion. This sounds good. Now, the alternative is we devalued the dollar and we'll realize the loss. I mean, it's the same 375, but realize 37 billion loss. So, from that point of view, no one is willing to realize the loss today and is willing to push the loss to tomorrow. But of course, because you're accumulating reserves, all you're doing, you're pushing a bigger loss for tomorrow. Okay? So, it's very easy. Well, let's not recognize anything. We just increased 375 to 400. It's going to be someone else's problem. Actually, this is exactly how it works in Western-style democracies. Alright? It's exactly how it works because you have a framework where politicians are elected for 4 years. And politicians don't want to deal with the problem today. They'd rather push it tomorrow for the next politician, for the next governor of the Federal Reserve, etc., etc. So when you have these type of temporary positions, you know, elected for 2 or for 4 years, the incentive is always to not to do the right thing, but to do what is politically acceptable or okay today, and increase or accumulate the problem. So essentially, for any country, reserves are the country's monetary and fiscal and financial strength. But when reserves begin to grow too much, then it actually turns out to be a real problem. It turns out to be a liability. Alright? It's like me owning, 50 billion today, but with those 50 billion can't really get anything, and everyone's owning me more. So essentially, what this represents is a conversion of on-the-ground oil with true, genuine, intrinsic wealth into paper dollars, which potentially have value, but when you try to cash, it turns out not to be that easy. Well, now you got to understand, if you have $100 in your pocket, it's easy to cash it, right? You just buy whatever, car, whatnot, doesn't matter, player. When you have, so it's very easy to spend $1 million. It's difficult to spend $1 billion. When you begin to spend billions, you actually get to have a lot of problems, all right? Questions? Is this clarified? Is it time to go? Well, 10 more minutes. More questions?
Yeah, about, because there's like the inflation and the prices are going up.
Okay, inflation, prices going up,
yeah. The people ask the king to, to give the salaries, to increase the salaries.
Okay.
And then the GCC countries, they increase the salaries by like 70% or 80%.
Okay.
And then our government increased it only 5% for 3 years. Each year it's 5%.
Okay.
So at the end it will be 15%.
Correct.
And then after that they will review it. So it's
possibly.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is what what they say, they will review it. They might take it back and they might increase it.
Okay. So what you're telling me is that while other GCC countries, they had a review of government salaries of 50, maybe 70%, here you got a cumulative for 3 years of 15%. 5% annually for 3 years, which adds up to a cumulative of 15% for 3 years. So, okay, so that's the fact, but the question is, what is the question?
Yeah, the question is, people was upset.
Okay, so people are upset, yes.
Yeah, and the government is saying that it's, even if we increase, the inflation will increase,
Yes, okay, so this is known
They're saying
as...
that the inflation rate is 5%, so that's what they're giving.
Yearly.
Correct. This is known as the wage price spiral. And here the government is actually perfectly correct.
So who
Let's-
the
let's-
government did the smart thing or the other?
Okay, let's explain. Let's explain what is the. You gotta understand what this means, right? I mean, we're economics, and then we talk the government. So the economics simply means if we raise wages by 20%, and let's say these are government wages, and let's say half of the whole income in the whole economy is based on government income from government wages. This means that the total income for the economy will increase roughly by, let's say, 20% if you raise wages by 20%, because the private sector must respond in a competitive manner and raise roughly right about 20%. This means that suddenly you have a sudden surge of income of 20%, and immediately prices will rise by almost 20%. So it is true that a significant increase in wages will almost always result in a significant increase in prices. And what happens then? As soon as everyone sees the new prices rising at 20%, you're going to ask for higher wages. And higher wages cause higher prices cause higher wages, and this becomes a vicious circle. Of course, there is a necessary condition for this. Wages and prices cannot increase unless in the background the money supply is being printed and the money supply is being increased. This is absolutely necessary to print the money in the background. But usually the pressure is so phenomenal when prices begin to rise a lot for any society, America, Bulgaria, Saudi Arabia, that the government has little choice but to print up the money in order to give it. Well, they are printing the money anyway because the reserves are accumulating, right? The reserves are accumulating, so the money is printed anyway. But if they give it to the people, this will certainly exacerbate the problem. And the reason, you have to understand, this is the same old lesson which I did with the rentals. You're trying to fix the problem, but not at the core and not at the cause, but somewhere down the effect. The core was fixing $3.75 for $1, US running the deficits, and Saudi Arabia accepting the ever devaluing dollars. And by keeping it fixed, this means ever devaluing Riyal. Alright? This is the cause. This is the problem. And by raising wages at 20% is not going to fix the problem. It actually will drive the economy into a vicious cycle of ever worsening inflation. And it will have a lot worse side effects.
Okay, now you're saying that they'd have to print money to increase the wages and then...
Sure, look, prices went up 20%. If the government is paying to the people, where's the government going to get the money?
Yeah, but isn't that, well, they would get it from the, they have more income now.
Yes, but they have more income, but yes.
So they're not supposed to print money. They don't need to print money because the oil prices. They
are getting more money from the oil.
So their income is increasing. So they already have
but they're getting more dollars for the oil. But now, due to this problem, they're forced to print up more Riyal to accommodate the oil. You see, you're saying they're getting more income, but you always must specify they're getting more dollar income. But the problem is $3.75, and the dollar income must be monetized, meaning that the monetary authority must create the Riyal, okay? And now the government has, instead of dollars, Riyal, all right? And remember, think of it, suppose just the government, you never used dollars and the dollar didn't exist, they had Riyal. They don't print the Riyal, so they, raise wages by 20%. Everyone gets 20% more Riyal, but everyone's getting it monthly. Next month, you get more Riyal. Next year, you get 20% more. Next year, you get 20% more. At one point, if they don't print money, the quantity of Riyal which people will get will exceed the money supply. You see? You cannot grow wages at 20% unless money supply grows to close to 20%. Because wages are always given, let's say, on the 1st of the month or 24th or whatever your date is. And you have to, at some point, the wages will be larger than the quantity of money. And when the payday comes, the Riyal will not be there. So, mathematically, it is impossible in the long... They can do it for a month, they can do it for a year, but in the long run, they can't. But remember, higher dollar income must necessarily translate into higher Riyal. And the root of the problem is the 375.
But if we weren't linked to the dollar anyway, we wouldn't have this inflation rate going so high.
Yes, as long as the government allows the Riyal to appreciate against other currencies. In other words, as long as the government allows the dollar and other currencies to depreciate. Right now, but we got to understand what is happening now is not unique to Saudi Arabia and is not unique to the GCC. China is suffering from the very same problem. They had wild energy inflation, much worse because of the problems here. So, did you change the cassette?
Yes.
Okay. So, they have a much higher energy inflation. Here you don't feel it because it's fixed. They have much higher food inflation. They have much higher overall inflation. And their money supply grows at, again, same old 20% roughly. So in China, things are a lot worse actually. In India, things are now a whole lot worse because the Indian government not only has these problems, but the Indian government has other fiscal deficits, other fiscal problems. So they print even more. And in India, inflation is even worse. Now, Japan is facing these same problems. It's very tricky with Japan. Officially, they report 1 or 2% inflation. But in reality, those things that Japanese consume, these prices are going up. I mean, they consume energy, they consume food. And just like the prices are going up here, they're going up in Japan. So somehow, the Japanese government, well, for some other reasons, is trying to artificially suppress the value of the Japanese yen, and this, of course, artificially lowering the yen and keeping other currencies artificially high is the same as stimulating exports. But it is not a stimulus of the export, it is an export subsidy. It is an export subsidy. Well, who pays for the subsidy? Well, if the yen is artificially low, this means that all imports are artificially high. So whatever Japan is importing is imported at an artificially high price. Well, whatever is imported is typically consumed. So consumers effectively subsidize exporters. So usually exporters are a small group, highly concentrated, highly motivated, highly influential with the government. Usually consumers are millions or tens of millions, highly dispersed and unorganized, and usually do not have these pressure groups on the government. And this is one of the reasons why so many countries keep their currencies artificially low, in order to subsidize exporters at the expense of, well, this is like an inflation tax, this is like an import tax. But if your currency is 10% cheaper and you're paying 10% more, you're effectively paying a 10% import tax, like a tariff, okay, import tariff. Well, all importers and consumers are effectively paying the tariff, which is a pure subsidy to exports, okay? Essentially, from a Saudi point of view, I say, well, but the oil will become relatively more expensive and we will be producing less of it. Even better. Number one, it is exhaustible, right? So it is a depletable resource. So you're going to be preserving more of it, which is really good. But there's a second trick. Because it became more expensive, remember demand elasticity that we did 2 hours ago? You cut down on production, you're going to get the benefit of demand elasticity. So it's not going to be that bad after all. It could turn out to be to the pure benefit after all, because making it more expensive for Americans, actually you're going to be getting more from the others. More from the others. In other words, let me try to make it this way. Whatever is sold and got as a revenue from Americans, it will, maybe 10% will be lost. But whatever you export to the others, you can actually even more than compensate, potentially. Right? Because now Chinese and everyone else will be buying more. Okay? Is good enough? More questions? No? No questions? Just want to go home? Okay, well, we're done.